morning's panel. Today's panel will be looking at structural and institutional barriers. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment of silence to remember the men and women who have served our country. Today is Veterans Day, both living and deceased. Okay, our first speaker will be Kari Danser. She will be presenting her paper, Examining What Successful Reentry Looks Like, Looking Beyond Recidivism Rates to the Human Experience. Come on up, Kari.
Do I have to share it?
Oh, yeah, you just share it.
I can do that. Maybe. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kari Danser, and today I'll be discussing my research examining what successful reentry looks like, looking beyond recidivism rates to the human experience. As for some background information, a returning citizen is defined as an individual that is returning home after prison. Ooh, should I admit them?
Yeah.
Sorry. The term returning citizen is used to replace words such as ex-convict and ex-felon, and it's used to erase the stigma behind the words. And in 2020 alone, there were 45,120 people in Pennsylvania's prison systems, and there were 1.8 million people incarcerated nationwide. And roughly 95% of the prison population will be released at some point in time. And according to the Department of Justice, 650,000 people are released each year. As for recidivism rates, they're used to determine how likely a person is to reoffend. And it's used to judge the success rate of individuals and the programs that these individuals are listed in. And it can imply a person has committed a new crime, the same crime that has landed them in prison, or a violation of parole or probation. And just some quick facts about parole. It's where the offenders are conditionally released from prison to serve the remainder of their term in the community. And probation is where adult offenders are placed under supervision in the community. And in 2020, there were 110,932 people on federal community supervision, and 897 of them were on parole, and 14,658 were on probation. So my overall research question is, can successful reentry be defined by those that lived it? And what barriers impacted returning citizens the most? My study was broken down into two phases. Phase one was the literature review, and this is where I dove into the literature review, the literature to look at prison statistics, what recidivism rates are, and anything I could find about returning citizens. And this is the phase where I made my interview questions for phase two. And then phase two is still ongoing, and I do have IRB approval to do this, but I'm conducting interviews with returning citizens. So my interviews were conducted in a one-to-one fashion via Zoom, and these interviews were recorded, and I was taking notes during the process. So once I was done, the data from the notes and the transcriptions were observed for common themes that the individual themselves said, and then compared with the other individuals that I interviewed. These are just an example of the 9 questions that I asked. I'll go into these further later, but the first 3 were demographics, and the rest were just about their reentry experiences that they faced themselves. Before I get into my results, I just want to take a special note to say that these words, I did not change them from the returning citizens. I felt it was more powerful to leave exactly what they said instead of trying to put it in these fancy scientific terms. So the first 3 questions, like I said, were the demographic questions, and I asked them how long they served or spent in prison, the age when they were released, and the amount of time it's been since they were released. So the shortest amount of time was 2 years, the longest being 16. The youngest individual when they were released was 26, the oldest was 60. The shortest amount of time since release was 2.5 years, and the longest was 17. So I asked these individuals if they were offered any resources when they were released. 2 of the 4 that I interviewed were not offered any. 1 individual had to ask for resources, and 1 was only offered a halfway house. I asked these individuals how they would characterize successful reentry, and their responses were a house, job, familial relationships, getting on with one's life, joining back into society, a normal way of living, commitment to better oneself, thriving, and a support system. So then I analyzed all of these responses for the 4 common themes that I've noticed between the interviews. And the first one was a house. Second was job. Third was joining back into society. And the 4th one was a support system. So I asked the individuals how they would characterize unsuccessful reentry. And they said going back, not realizing why, homeless, no family or job, returning to old habits, not allowed the same opportunities, a systematic failure to help, a non-supportive environment, and not giving yourself a chance to succeed. Again, common themes were looked at, and those were going back and not realizing why, homeless, no job, and a non-supportive environment. I asked these individuals how they would characterize their own reentry, and these individuals did not give me their successful or unsuccessful response. They went more in depth, and they said it was a long process. It was growing mentally to owning past, having their family back in their life, ups and downs, taking advantage of life coaches and support systems, getting involved in the community, being honest with who you are, and not being ashamed to ask for help. Again, common themes were looked at, and the only common theme with their reentry was that it was a long, ongoing process. So I asked these individuals what the toughest barrier was they had to overcome. And they said accepting mental health, adjusting back into the community, what people think of you, housing, seeing friends, going to church, and one individual even said themselves. And the common theme was adjusting back into the community. But this can even be further broken down into what people think of you, seeing your friends after you've been released, and like going to church. Like one individual even stated that going to church changed for them as they no longer felt welcome by the church. I asked these individuals, was there anything that was expected to be a problem, but wasn't? And their responses were job, acclimating to a new environment, employment. One individual said that everything that was expected to be a problem was, so they were prepared. And one individual even said, no, life shows up. But I do want to take a second to decipher between job and employment. These individuals explain job as a stepping stone, as a temporary position to help them make ends meet, where employment was you stayed at the same job and planned on working your way up through the ranks to get a higher position. For overall results, resources were not offered as often as they believed. Successful reentry was defined as having a home, a job, joining back into the community, and having a support system. Unsuccessful reentry was unemployed, homeless, going back and not realizing why, and a lack of support. When I asked them about their reentry, they said it was a long, ongoing process, and they would not classify it as successful or unsuccessful. The toughest barrier was adjusting back into the community, which can then be broken down into seeing friends, going to church, and even battling yourself. And the expected problems were, again, were just job, new environment, employment, everything, and life shows up. So for limitations to this study, time is a huge one. These interviews take roughly an hour, and it takes me about 2 to 3 hours to analyze the responses and look for common themes. The population itself is another limitation, as the returning citizen population that is willing to talk about their experience is relatively small. So it was hard for me to get responses back from individuals. And of the 4 individuals that I've interviewed, 3 of them were men and 1 was a woman. So that shows some skewing of my data. So I would like to try to interview more women to see if they have similar experiences, but as of right now, it's showing that they do. And also the comfortability. The majority of my population was men, and they spent most of their time with men in prison. So being interviewed by a young female like myself created this disconnect where they might not have been as open with me as they would have liked to be, just because being around a different gender. As for future directions, I would like to conduct more interviews. I have more interviews scheduled, and I would like to conduct more interviews with females, but again, it's kind of hard to find females that are willing to talk about the reentry experience. And I'd like to use the Max QDA software, and that's just a text analysis software, which will help me analyze my data better than by hand. Just some overall conclusions. Common themes have been observed for barriers, successful reentry and unsuccessful reentry, and each individual's reentry experience has been different. These 4 individuals themselves have had similar instances, but they haven't had the exact same reentry experience. So that just shows that each individual will not have the same reentry experience. More can be done to help those reenter, especially in the beginning steps, as only half of the population was offered resources, and one of those individuals even had to ask for the resources. And a better method for success stories can be used, as recidivism is not reliable, as it takes into account parole and probation violations in a new crime or committing the same crime that landed them in prison. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Lindsay Ferrara, who's my research advisor, in the Ferrara Research Group, my committee members, Josh Ellsworth and Tom Farrow, Duquesne's Forensic Science Law Program, the Bayer School. I'd like to acknowledge the returning citizens for allowing me to interview them, and the Elsinore Banu think tank for their support. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank the veterans and their families for their service. So any questions?
Any questions on the floor here? Any questions from our audience watching online? I'll stop the share for a second. So I have a question for you. So you're correct when we say that we define recidivism as kind of a muddled concept, that we mix new violations with parole and probation violations, which may not be crimes for everyday citizens. How would you want to break down that classification? How would you want to refine that definition?
That's what I'm hoping to use these interviews to find out, is to find if there's a better way to make a success story. So it's kind of hard to tell. This is the whole goal. So I can't answer that right now, but once I get more interviews, I will let you know.
Okay. Anybody online? Anybody in our audience? Go ahead.
What do you believe is the reason why women are less likely to allow?
I actually was not expecting to get any women for this research, but I reached out to somebody that I knew, returning citizens, so they sent some my way. And I even asked her for help finding people that would be willing to talk, and just nobody talked about it. It's a touchy subject, so it's hard to get people to talk about those experiences that they don't want to talk about.
Did you find most of the people you were willing to or who were willing to be interviewed in the Elsinore Banu think tank?
Yes and no. So that was good. Oh, do you have a question?
Hi, Dee, go for it, Dee, sorry.
That's okay. I was just wondering, I know that you said that you were a little bit concerned about your personal demographics playing a role in the bias that the answers might receive, but I was just wondering if your work through the think tank has helped you bridge some of those barriers, or if you have some kind of maybe community engaged idea, maybe you could bring somebody in with you who's more a part of that demographic. I was just kind of curious about ways that you might address that.
That's actually something I really thought about. I do think being a part of the think tank has helped tremendously. And I also thought about bringing Josh along on some of my interviews, who's my committee member, who's worked personally with some of the think tank members before and other returning citizens. So I think he could be a way to bridge that disconnect as well.
Any other questions? Sorry, Dee, didn't mean to step on you.
And when you're going through the analysis of all of your data, is it just your research team, or do you have any kind of input or feedback in the analysis process from return citizens?
Dee, can you repeat that? You kind of cut out.
Sure, I'm sorry. I was wondering, in the analysis of your data, and I know that you haven't really gotten to that portion yet as you're still doing interviews, but do you plan to have any returned citizens themselves go through that with you, or share your findings with them for improvement at all?
I leave that up to them. Some have reached out and said, I would like to be a part of the process and find out what you have found out. And some are like, nah, I don't really want to know. I'm just here to be interviewed. So some want to, some don't.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions for our speaker, Kari? Very nice job, Kari. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Mykenzie Connally, Breaking the Bond, the Trauma Experienced by Incarcerated Mothers and Their Children.
I would like to thank everyone for having me here. My name is Mykenzie Connally. I'm an undergraduate student at Chatham University, and I am in the criminology program. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that as a white person, a lot of the experiences I will be covering today will never be mine. And also, a lot of the data I am presenting is very binary because that is literature that is currently available. So I just wanted to make everyone aware. There's little research on pregnant incarcerated women, and the resources that are available approach race in different ways. I wanted to analyze how these individuals were treated postpartum specifically within jails and prisons. But however, because I'm an undergraduate student, I don't have a lot of resources due to confidentiality. So I decided to do a literature review. I primarily touch on the separation of mother and child postpartum and how the separation of the maternal bond affects their relationship. We will discuss my research itself, the results that I found, and touch on future research ideas. So after deciding to compile a literature review, how did I pick a specific topic? I had many questions to begin. I'm a criminology major with 2 minors and certificate. So as you can imagine, I have many interests. So it was very difficult for me to kind of whittle down what I specifically wanted to talk about. But I relied on my advisors and some librarians to help me choose a specific topic. And I landed on the separation of incarcerated mothers from their children. So why did I decide to focus on Black women? Well, as much as the evidence suggests, Black women are included in research considerably less than Black men, yet they're the fastest growing prison population. Due to mass incarceration, the number of women in prisons and jails has increased, has increased by 587% since 1980, and 2/3 of the female prison population are women of color. As a result, 1 in 9 African-American children have a parent who is incarcerated, compared to the 1 in 57 white children. 1 in 5 children who arrive at child welfare centers have recently had a parent arrested. Black women and Black mothers are disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system, and so are their children, so their voices deserve to be heard. Are Black mothers being represented in this literature? What are some of the effects of breaking the maternal bond? Here's what the research suggests so far. Parental incarceration is now considered to be an adverse childhood effect, or ACE, and some other ACEs include parental abuse, homelessness, death of a parent, and bullying in school. Parental incarceration is now on the same list as these experiences. Some of its effects last through adulthood. Children whose mothers are incarcerated have significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, attention deficits, learning disabilities, and antisocial personality traits. They are more likely to have 1 or more suicide attempts. Some studies showed an increase in aggression in males, while others showed no correlation. Physically, there are higher rates of drug and alcohol abuse, contraction of STIs, and there are links to various heart issues. Breaking the maternal bond, no matter at what age, can cause significant effects. Mothers who are forced to part from their child described their pregnancies as a much happier time than after giving birth. They felt overwhelming love for the baby before immediately being separated. After childbirth and separation, the mothers had feelings of emptiness, guilt, and shame. To reconnect, they would look at baby pictures, they would daydream about the future, and continually ask when they could see their child again. When incarceration causes the bond to be broken, it is very difficult to rebuild and mend the family ties, and that is simply one piece of life after incarceration. Children with a parent that was or is incarcerated are more likely to experience inadequate education, living in poverty, homelessness, and or have other instabilities in their home. Black women disproportionately experience post-incarceration trauma in halfway houses, rehabilitation facilities, and while searching for employment. Many of the women in the studies experience symptoms of PTSD related to mistreatment not only during incarceration, but also after. One study titled "I Am Not Your Felon" had a primary focus on the experiences of Black mothers. The article discusses reintegration, different forms of resilience, post-incarceration trauma, and how the bad Black mother trope affects what they call recovering mothering, and much more. Recovering mothering is defined as regaining the psychological sense of self that is intricately linked to their role and performance as mothers. Many of the other resources I reviewed still mentioned race, whether it be in their demographics or as a full section of their discussion, but none of them covered race to the same extent as I Am Your Felon, which was just released in May of this year. That being said, I am not here to discredit the work that has already been done, but I would like to build upon it with different perspectives. I've also primarily viewed scholarly articles and fact sheets, and I would like to include more newspaper articles and more media in the future to see what people are really saying about this. There are many branches that can stem from this topic, and the articles included, at least 2 of the articles included claim to be the first to use their perspective. So there's definitely a lot that can be used from those specifically. For race, I would like to see further exploration into the concept of recovering mothering, as well as an analysis of how historically different social expectations affect the separation of mothers from their children. I would also like to see more focus on mothers who do not identify as women or parents who identify as neither a mother or a father. However, how does the pregnancy experience differ while incarcerated if identifying outside the gender binary is what I would really like to see a lot of research on. Lastly, while I did not focus on programs in my research, I would like to see a comparison of results with and without the separation of mother and child postpartum within different available programs. In conclusion, there is much space to expand on the literature that has already been done, and I would very much like to continue working on this subject in the future. I would like to thank my advisors, Dr. Christine Sarteski and Dr. Alexander Resnick, for supporting me in doing this research and for continuing to support me for future analysis. And I would also like to thank all of you for listening.
Review, sorry. Can you see it now, Anita? Have you missed the whole slides?
I was able to see the slides. You might have to change this view.
Okay. Okay, so let me open up to the floor. Any questions?
I apologize if I missed this in the beginning of your presentation, but what made you start this research and why is it so important to you?
So last semester, I actually did a paper on pregnant incarcerated women and how they're a victim group that isn't usually talked about. So I had already been thinking about it in previous semesters, but I don't know, I wanted to kind of expand on that and look at different perspectives.
Any questions? Any more questions? I've got questions, but I just want, before I start asking mine. Okay, so my first question is, how many states provide mothers the opportunity to possibly stay with their newly born child?
So in the research I did before, I believe there was about 2 or 3 programs, but they're not very well known and they're very difficult to get into. I don't remember which states they're in. I think Pennsylvania specifically might have one either in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. But even the ones that do allow mother and child to stay together, it's usually for only a few months or only for a specific time period. So it's very strict.
So what would your policy recommendations be to, say, Governor Wolf, in terms of helping mothers who are incarcerated and who experience a pregnancy and then deliver a child while incarcerated?
So it is very difficult because there's a lot of emotions, especially not only postpartum, but also like children whose mothers have been incarcerated, they might not want to see their mother. So I think it would be on a very individual basis. So I feel like there's a lot to go off there, but.
I just have a question.
Yes.
Do you think that maybe we could look to other countries where they seem to have better prison systems,
Mhm.
I would say, and see what they have done and use that as an example. Would you ever look into like global research on that?
I would definitely love to look at that. I really enjoy looking at other criminal justice system in comparison to ours. I haven't done so on this topic yet, but I do think that would be very interesting, yes.
Prison's definitely very,
It's very different.
Yeah. I've got two comments, let's see. Okay, looks like we're okay. Any more questions, folks? Anybody in the audience?
I just have one more.
Yeah.
Have you found any literature on like what happens if mothers want to breastfeed? Are they just not allowed? Are they allowed to come in the prison and somebody takes it? Do you know anything about that?
I do not. However, I feel like they probably aren't allowed to breastfeed. I have no clue what the policies are on that, but thinking about how the children are immediately taken away, I would assume they're probably not allowed to breastfeed.
In your research, you know, the previous project or this one now,
Mhm.
have you looked at the kind of criticism of a lot of those programs that allow the children to stay in prison, or, you know, have you thought about the kind of maybe the negative consequences of spending your early infancy, toddler years incarcerated with your parent?
I have not, I'm not sure if there is any research on that currently because I think the programs are fairly recent. So that might be something to look out for in the next couple decades, see how like children who did grow up in that environment, or even for a small amount of time, if that has affected them.
I know my home state has a program and the kids can stay till like they're 3 or 4 with mom, but it's a very selective program and it's highly controversial. So there's only like 100 women or something like that.
Yeah, and I wonder how race plays into who is accepted into those programs as well.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to see.
Yeah.
Do you know, Dr. Puppy, you might know this, Dr. Pup, are they, if the children are with them in your state's program,
Mhm.
are they still in like a regular cell or do they get a different?
So they are in, instead of being like bars, it's got a door with a window in it, and so they're alone in their cell with the baby. So that they're not sharing a cell with it's kind of like a dorm with locks. So everybody gets locked in at night. And there's more public spaces where the mothers can congregate and share their child. That's really like work with other mothers about how they're parenting and like learning parenting skills.
Sort of along those lines, do either of the kids or Dr. Pop, if you know in cases where you are able to be with your baby in a cell, or as you described it in kind of a dorm style situation, what kind of prenatal and postnatal care are those babies and mothers receiving? Are there doctors in-house that are going to be providing that care, or do doctors come in, or do the babies get taken to different doctors, or etc.? I'm just wondering if you have come across anything like that in the literature.
So I know there is literature on prenatal care. I have not specifically looked into it. I imagine there's probably a spectrum of women getting care. I imagine there's a difference between all women prisons and not all women prisons. So I wouldn't feel confident answering, but
My answer is probably basically the same. The vast majority of women get some level of care, but it's definitely subpar what you would get on the outside.
I actually do remember some women were given like pregnancy packs is what they were called, where they got like an extra apple for the day and like a small bottle of water. But I definitely remember when I looked into those, they were very minimal and definitely not enough for a pregnant woman.
And there's almost no there's no care for the infants. That most states don't have any plans because they don't allow the baby to stay. Most women lose possession of their child within minutes of delivery. I mean, it's not even very long. A half hour, 90 minutes, something in that ballpark for most states.
I also wonder
Sorry, I didn't step on your presentation.
No, that's okay. I find this really
This is a
interesting.
good conversation.
I also wonder how postpartum depression plays a role in whether they're separated or not. Like, I wonder if there's differences there, how the prison system sort of how they take care of that, like whether they ignore it or if they're given care. Yeah, right.
Any questions? Yeah. Any questions in our?
No, I do have one in the chat. Did any of the literature focus on the birth process for the women? So I specifically did not look at the birth process because I know there's a lot of literature on the shackling of women during birth and women being in solitary confinement during their pregnancy. But I specifically wanted to look at after birth because I wanted to look at the psychological effects on the children. But there definitely is a lot of research on that.
One last call for questions. We can open it up after our last presentation as well, return to questions. Okay,
All right, thank you.
thank you. Good job, Mykenzie. I liked it. It was a good talk. Oop,
Oh, I also have handouts of my work cited if anyone's interested in like looking at the fact sheets that I found.
Okay. Our third presenter is Taylor Kottler. Her paper is entitled Marijuana Stigmatization and the Criminal Justice System. And I'm going, where is Zoom? I'll share that screen for you.
You said you shared it?
Yep, I can see it.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Taylor Kottler. I'm a senior here at Duquesne, and I chose the topic of marijuana stigmatization and the criminal justice system primarily because I've always had an interest in crime and law in general, and how there are disparities within our criminal justice system. So just to give a brief history of the criminalization of marijuana, it does have racist roots going back to the early 1900s when Mexican immigrants were coming into southern states like Texas. There was a prejudice attached to them as being, violent, crazy, and marijuana was attributed to inducing those behaviors, along with Black neighborhoods as well. So by the time of 1937, most states have already outlawed marijuana, but the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 made it federally illegal, other than medicinal purposes, because before then, you could actually get marijuana in pharmacies, doctor's office. And this acted as kind of a precursor for the war on drugs. The Controlled Substance Act that was implemented in 1970, it classified marijuana as a Schedule I drug, which means that it is at a high risk for potential abuse. It has no medicinal values, the highest and most serious of all drugs. And it also brought about mandatory minimum sentencing, which has led to a lot of mass incarceration surrounding drug crimes. And so something that was interesting to me as well as to why I wanted to look at this topic is the world we live in today. Most people condone at least or support legalization, at least medicinally. So just to give some numbers of the evolution of legalization. Since 2014, almost $8 billion has been generated in states, and those are only recreational states. And the majority of legal marijuana businesses are primarily ran by white people, which kind of reinforces this racial disparity between drugs. And as of right now, there are 18 states that allow for the recreational use of marijuana, and 37 states for medicinal. And so my research, I focused on a couple of different things. So I examined different statistics of marijuana arrests across different races, and kind of the hypocrisy of it all being that states have been able to benefit financially off of the sale of marijuana, but there are still people entangled in the criminal justice system due to it. And also determine the causes and consequences of the stigmatization around marijuana and the impacts it has on people's lives. So through some literary analysis, some research I found, this is a study conducted in New York, and it just shows the large disparities between Black arrests and stops as opposed to their representation in the population as a whole. So out of every 1,000 people, 14.83 Black people were stopped for marijuana, as opposed to if you look at white people are below 2. And if you look at arrests, the disparities also translate there, saying that Black people, 48 out of every 1,000 are arrested for marijuana, as opposed to 6 for white people. These are some more statistics. This study was conducted in California. So the green bar shows the marijuana drug arrests from 2000 to 2008 compared to the overall population that was in the state at the time. So you see how whites are, below their representative population, and Blacks are disproportionately higher than their population, they're being the lowest. Out of the Hispanics, I thought it was interesting how this data was about even, but again, this shows that there must be some form of selective enforcement, given that practically everyone regards that people use marijuana equally across races. So why is this happening? Like I said, obviously there are some disparities of how the laws are being enforced. Black people are 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than white people. This also has a lot to do with the fact of urban areas, like the studies we looked at are in New York and California. So in bigger cities, it's more easy to pick out if somebody is smoking marijuana, or easy to target large groups of minorities at one time. And there's still some gray area as far as even in legal states, because marijuana still is illegal in some contexts. You have to be over 21 years old. You're not supposed to smoke outside. So police could, at their discretion, enforce laws unfairly. And the institutional racism and or overt racism, I believe that as there is clearly institutional racism in our criminal justice system, it does stem from these racist thoughts, negative prejudices towards minorities. And this is this has been able to persist for so long because of the policies that have been implemented, especially in like the 90s, the tough on crime approaches, you know, for low level, nonviolent drug offenses. And then the broken windows policing idea is that, you know, taking care of the little things in society, you know, such as drug possession, low-level drug possession, nonviolent offenses, homelessness, these are detrimental to society, so they need to be stopped. And most of the arrests surrounding marijuana are for possession, so it's not for trafficking. So it claims that the criminal justice system is trying to stop these drug kingpins from trafficking in marijuana just is not true. And the consequences of this, any criminal history, but especially drug offenses, present a variety of future barriers in all aspects of people's lives. This can lead to no access to public housing, SNAP benefits. Also, it presents future employment difficulties, whether it be society's negative ideas towards them or them not being able to get a job due to their criminal record. And if you are convicted of a drug felony, you are not able to receive a lot of student loans. So even people, ex-convicts trying to better their lives are stopped in many ways. It's true for a lot of immigrants to this country. If they get caught with drug possession, they'll often be deported. Loss of voting rights is really important, I believe, because it takes away these people's voice in trying to change these policies that have negatively impacted them. And it also disadvantages them economically in a variety of ways, having to pay lawyer fees, restitution, fines. And this also, you know, attaches this negative identity to them. So they may feel disconnected from society. Family may not be around anymore. And this kind of feeling of hopelessness, because the criminal justice system just seems to knock you down in so many different ways. You know, any way that you try to redeem your past issues, past harms to society, you're not able to in many ways. So some of my conclusions that I came to, clearly the history and prohibition of marijuana is rooted in the racial prejudice of minority groups, and it still affects them today. The criminal justice system as a whole feeds and profits off of marginalizing vulnerable groups, as the criminal justice system makes a lot of money off of these people in and out of the system, even if they're not necessarily incarcerated for these crimes. They're still either violating probation or parole, just keeping them in the system one way or another. And there definitely needs to be reparations for the negative consequences imposed by the US drug policy. Even in states that have decriminalized marijuana, often their past convictions are still there, which prohibits them, negatively affects them in many ways. So the need for expungement of all records surrounding marijuana, I believe, could be a positive step in serving for these harms. And that's all I got.
I'm going to open the floor up to questions. Anybody? Go ahead, Brittany.
So you touched on this very briefly, the idea of there's a lot of gray area and there are discretionary policies. So a few years ago, the city of Pittsburgh employed one of these kind of discretionary policies that says officers can choose whether to cite a person for having marijuana or arrest them. And I just wondered if you saw that a lot in your review of the literature and kind of your opinion on that.
Yeah, I did find that it is often up to the law enforcement discretion. That's primarily like one of the reasons why I wanted to look into this, because it really just does show the unfairness that the criminal justice system continues to employ to minorities. Obviously, it's still federally illegal. It's still a Schedule I drug, so federal law obviously trumps state law if it gets to that point. So yeah, I know there's really not much of a solution to it other than it being legalized or at least descheduled federally.
Other questions from the floor? Questions from our Zoom audience, please? Dee, is that your hand up for real or?
Yeah, it is. Hi, I have a question. It's kind of long-winded, I'm sorry, and it's okay if you don't know it. I'm just curious about like the data collection itself and if you know anything about it. So for example, like I know the government collects a lot of data on sexual assault, but then it's expected that the true numbers of that are much higher because of the way that they measure it, and they can only count like certain cases that are reported, and the definition is a little bit uncertain. So I'm wondering if you have any sense of like if this might be a problem in this area too. Like I'm not trying to doubt your data at all. I'm just wondering if it might be, if this issue or these disparities might be worse than the data is able to report or record, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, definitely. The data that I showed was like in the early 2000s, so that was like during a time where it was really tough on crime and marijuana wasn't as accepted as it is today. Yeah, kind of data differed across what I looked at really. Even in states that have legalized it, there's still, even if arrests have decreased, there's still a disparity in who is getting arrested for it, how the laws are still being enforced. So yeah, that's what I'd like to further look into, get an accurate account of how many people have been incarcerated due to marijuana.
Other questions? In the chat. You have to read it because I'm blind. Oh, good job. Any other questions? For Taylor? Go ahead.
Do you know what the discussion has been around legalizing marijuana in Pennsylvania?
I know there's been a few bills passed to, well, it's legal medicinally, you know, but to further legalize it recreationally. I know there's been bills proposed. I don't know what the status of that really is, but New York recently legalized it recreationally, as well as Virginia. So in my opinion, within the next 10 years, I would say. There's also, just as I said before, how much money you can make off of it. So I would say that within the next 5 to 10 years, even, it would probably be legalized recreational here.
I read an article a while back, probably a couple of years ago now, that was saying how we would become reliant on legalizing marijuana if New York and New Jersey were to legalize it. And I didn't know that they had, so that's why I was wondering.
Oh, yeah. It's been recent that New York legalized it recreationally, but yeah, I think it's just slowly, it will happen. And given that we have a pretty fair, a fairly big medicinal market in Pennsylvania already.
Do you plan to do anything else with this research?
I really wanted to see how many people are currently in incarcerated for marijuana crimes. But a lot of data I found was like the impacts of it. So, you know, obviously if you get charged with like a small possession amount, you're not going to be incarcerated. So there was a lot of data about, you know, the consequences of this, but that's what I would like to research, what it's currently doing. It's currently impacting people, just because it's totally hypocritical, especially if you are in a state where, you know, they're making millions of dollars off of it, but then you're sitting in jail for doing that same thing pretty much. So.
Any other questions from the floor? Any more questions from our Zoom audience? Okay, thank you very much, Taylor. Okay. Oh, okay, question. Capital, thanks. Okay, we're gonna leave for 2 seconds while we get the last presentation up online. So now we have our last speaker, Brittany Urban, who is going to present her paper on examining the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on violent crime in the city of Pittsburgh. And I just go away. Where'd my Zoom go? Share screen. Brittany, go away. The hell? Let's see how much. Okay, there you go. Sorry. I'll take my phone with me.
Oh,
too,
sure.
So it doesn't remind me.
Sure. Okay, can everybody see me and hear me okay? I hope I'm tall enough for this camera. So my name is Brittany Urban, and I'm a graduate student at the former Center for Social and Public Policy.
Can you?
Yeah, sure. And I am also a crime analyst for the City of Pittsburgh Bureau of Police. So over the course of the COVID pandemic, we have seen a lot of changes in different types of crime. And this is sort of an ongoing look at the impact of violent crime on the COVID-19 pandemic, and moving forward, how we can learn from this kind of natural experiment of the COVID-19 pandemic to influence policy on how we deal with violent crime and how we can maybe intervene ahead of the opportunity for violent crime in the city. So over the course of the pandemic, starting in March 2020, our unit, the crime analysis unit, started working from home. Things were pretty quiet. There was almost an immediate drop off of calls for service, 911 calls, police reports, and generally all crime kind of just plummeted right in the middle of March. And especially those calls for service and reports just totally plummeted. So we started to think, okay, this is really going to be something. A lot of the focus was on domestic violence at the time, worries that stay-at-home orders would, kind of create the opportunity for violent domestic situations to arise where otherwise they would not. And we didn't see that actually at first. And one of our kind of ideas about why that maybe was the lower likelihood of people in those situations, maybe lower income people of certain populations, were less affected by stay-at-home orders, maybe more likely to be essential workers and things of that nature. And additionally, we saw that there were situations where crimes were sort of occurring, but there was less of an opportunity for someone to actually call and make a report because of those stay-at-home orders. So that was sort of the main focus in the beginning. And then we started seeing a lot of unrest across the country and also in Pittsburgh after the killing of George Floyd. And there was sort of a re-energizing of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we saw a lot of protests in the city of Pittsburgh and throughout the nation and even throughout the world. So following that sort of period of heightened unrest in Pittsburgh in the spring of 2020, the Mayor Peduto, called for a task force to be formed on community policing, a community task force on policing in the city of Pittsburgh. And so I'm going to read you the charge that he gave to the task force. Mayor Peduto said, I asked the task force, whose members come from diverse stakeholder communities, to lay out a blueprint for real and sustained change and reform for the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police, generating recommendations for concrete suggestions and people-oriented solutions that will make Pittsburgh a safe and healthy place for all of our citizens, especially for members of our Black community. So the focus of my research is sort of surrounding a few of these key points that came out of the recommendation report from the task force that was assembled by the mayor. And I can provide you with a copy of that report. I don't want to take up all this time just reading from my slides. So I've sort of condensed a few main, oops, I don't have my main points on here. I guess I will just read you a few of the key recommendations. Oops, is that a, oh, I don't see any. Oh, he did, okay. So some of the points that I took away from those recommendations, there were about 30 recommendations that came out of that list. We have reallocate PBP funding to more appropriately align human service functions currently handled by PBP. That was one of the main sort of themes of these recommendations, the allocation and reallocation of funding for different human services departments to kind of take over some of the action that had formerly been completed by police in response to violent crime. Another takeaway was strengthening and implementing more policies focused on de-escalation. So the city has a pretty robust police force training academy program, but a big focus that the community is asking of the police is to, make sure that we are committed to de-escalation techniques and definitely want to be employing best practices when it comes to de-escalation, because as we've seen time and again in our country, the opportunity for something to go wrong in a situation where a police is making contact with an individual is very high. So we want to make sure that we are focusing early and often on robust policies to inspire de-escalation in situations of that nature. And then the final sort of takeaway from these key points is to get the community more involved in framing the purpose of police in our society and in our city and our Pittsburgh communities. So taking more of a focus on community policing and sort of a more holistic approach to community policing in Pittsburgh. So those were sort of three of my takeaways from this collection of recommendations from the task force. So later in 2020, out of these recommendations was born the Office of Community Health and Safety. And their purpose, as described in their directive, is as follows. The Office of Community Health and Safety was established to address long-standing health, safety, and justice issues in the city of Pittsburgh. The office is tasked with redirecting city resources to better address community needs by housing, social services, public health, and social work experts who can assist the community members and first responders in situations that require longer-term support, harm reduction approaches, and other services. So while this work is still very in progress, I'm doing some of the work individually as a part of my studies, and certainly my team and I are doing some of this work as a group in office to try to influence the policies that will be set forth by the Office of Community Health and Safety in a time when we in Pittsburgh and certainly across the US are trying to reimagine what policing is and how we apply police to society. So here's sort of an initial look at the patterns of violent crime involving gun or firearm in the city of Pittsburgh, starting all the way back in January 2018, all the way through the third quarter, September 2021. So on my poster, which I'm sure you'll all get a chance to see a little later, I've started to map out markers of time where we start to see the first cases of COVID-19 in Allegheny County in this kind of early springtime, March 2020. And so throughout the course of the pandemic, certainly through the end of 2021 and leading into, the end of 2020 and leading into 2021, we've seen increases across different types of violent crime involving firearms compared to previous year averages, particularly when we look at homicides. So the question is why and what do we do about it, right? So as I've said, we're still sort of in the early phases, but I just wanted to show you a little bit of the comparisons of those numbers over time. So on the top row here, we have annual total homicides per year, including the year-to-date total homicides for the city of Pittsburgh as of yesterday. And then below, we have a comparison of the year-to-date to the third quarter among all these years. So as you can see, from 2018 to 2019, we're seeing a large reduction in homicide. That has been something that the city has touted as a great success over the past few years. Certainly a success in policing from their perspective, that fewer people are dying by homicide in the city of Pittsburgh. And then unfortunately in 2020, we start to see those numbers go way up. And so between 2020 and 2019, that was an increase of 37%, up from 37 homicides in 2019 to 51 total homicides in 2020. And so by this time last year, we had 48 homicides, or excuse me, we had 37 homicides, and now we're up to 45. So as you can see in 2016, 2017, those were when those numbers were a little bit higher. And then we start seeing that same decrease, as I've said, in 2018, 2019. And then in 2020, we start to go up 28%. And now by this quarter, we're up 22% and up 13% from the previous 5-year average. So this is sort of the framing for our research. We really want to understand what types of crimes can be pinpointed that, didn't drop off a cliff like we saw with many types of crime, theft and sort of more of those social high volume types of crime. But we didn't see that with gun violence and violent crime involving a firearm or gun. So this is sort of a preliminary look at those numbers. And in the future, I hope to do an analysis of the spatial distribution of these crimes to find out if they were higher in certain areas of the city and how policing may have impacted that or changed over the course of the pandemic. But as I've said, this is all pretty preliminary. And so that's sort of where we are on this. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
Anybody on the floor in the room? Anybody in the Zoom meeting have any questions?
Brittany, I thought that was really great. And I was just wondering, what can we do as people? How can we kind of make a difference, or what can we as a society do or as individuals to try and help these issues?
That's a great question. Thank you, Dee. I would say something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, sorry, Zed, so I can't see you. Is the Chief of Staff of the Police, Commander Eric Holmes, says this line. He makes this point a lot of times, and I think about it so often. He says, violent crime is inevitable, but it is preventable. And I think so far in the history of policing in America, police have been very reactionary, right? A crime occurs or something happens, and then police show up and try to do something about it. And I think we're finally starting to apply this theory that maybe there are some more preventative, effective means of getting human services and other types of services to individuals who are sort of in a situation where they might experience violent crime, or they might have the opportunity to commit a violent crime. And so to focus more on the preventative aspect of it, I think is going to be really important moving forward. So that is sort of the guiding light of this research, I'd say. As far as what we can all do, I would say go to your local community meetings. One thing I will say about the Pittsburgh Police is that they're very involved in local community meetings. Something that my team does a lot is compile statistics for and maps and things for different community groups across the city. And so you can tell which community groups are actively seeking out information from the police, because then those officers, community officers and beat officers and command staff are coming to us and saying, I got to go to this meeting. And we do some meetings on the monthly, some are just every once in a while. So I think you can really tell which communities are getting involved with their police and letting the police know, we're watching you and we want to work together to figure out what's going on here, instead of just, you know, being in your community and seeing police go by and they do whatever they want based on, you know, maybe our numbers or maybe their experiences and that sort of thing. So I think there's a really good opportunity for us all to be heard in our communities via community groups, and certainly just reaching out to your local police zone office. So there are 6 zones across the city, and there's the police headquarters, and there are a few substations throughout the city. And you can just Google those numbers, you know, Google your address where you live and call them up and say, hey, are there any meetings that you're going to be presenting at, or how can I get involved, or can I have an officer come to my community meeting and present some stats? And so then that'll be more work for me, but it's good. It'll keep me in the job. So so that would be my biggest recommendation, I think. Thank you, Dee.
Any questions from the floor?
I think there's something in the chat.
Oh, there's in the chat. Thank you. In the chat. I can't read that. Can you?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're good. Let's see.
It was me. On the flip side of that question, what are the biggest barriers or challenges that you see in enacting these prevention, harm reduction measures that you were talking about?
So I guess I would say that there's constantly this competing conversation of what is the right amount of police to apply to a community or to a city or to a certain crime type. So we get a lot of back and forth between, sometimes we're attending community meetings where people are saying, my garage got broken into 3 times in the past year. Why aren't the police here? Why aren't they making a presence? Why aren't they doing more? And then of course you have the flip side where people are saying, we are being totally over policed and over focused on, and it's only leading to negative outcomes in our community. So I think that a really big barrier to the, kind of like getting police less involved and getting like more civilians and more like social professionals involved is going to be that pushback from one side of the communities that says, we love the police, we want them to come, we're experiencing, crimes, and we want to make sure that preventative place, or at least police showing up and kind of acting as a preventative visual representation of, a consequence for doing a crime. So I think you'd be surprised how much kind of conflict there is just inside of neighborhoods and inside of communities, where it's just hard at this point to know what the right way forward is, and striking that balance of, like I've said, how much police to apply to our communities.
Thank you.
Did you address so Dr. Zuberi said, did you address the citizen review board that I think was part of the voting legislation a year or 2 ago? I did not. Thank you so much, Dr. Zuberi, for asking that. I did not address that in my presentation, but that's a really good question. The citizen police review board is something that I actually want to get more involved in. It's something that our unit hasn't communicated with very much, but as far as I understand, it's more just civilian, non-police involved professionals who are reviewing police actions in the city. So I did not touch on that, but that's a great question. And I am a big fan of the Citizen Review Board. I hope that they will get more kind of robust capabilities moving forward, especially as we're hopefully going to make these shifts away from police responding to certain call types and more mental health professionals and social workers responding to calls like that. So I'm excited to see, kind of where they go, and I expect that they'll gain some more power in the future. So I will definitely look into that because, like I said, I really want to get more involved in that as well. I think that was all from the chat.
Okay, so I have one question, Brittany.
Yes.
So I know that you're only, obviously the year hasn't even completed, but so why do you think that the homicide rates ticked up either in this COVID era? What's going on there? Do you have a gut check?
I do, and please just accept it as that, because I don't want to go making claims that are unsupported at this time, but I suspect that the people at communities that are experiencing these high rates of gun violence and certainly higher rates of homicide are living in situations where there's a lot of stress and a lot of crises.
Mhm.
And so I think that the pandemic and certainly the state of the economy over the past few years and really high tension political events such as the 2020 election, I think it's creating a very high stress situation in our society. So certainly people who were maybe already facing economic challenges, socioeconomic disadvantages are, it's just tightening that vice kind of. And I think that sort of situation is just a breeding ground for the opportunity for violent crime. So people who, and communities that are maybe experiencing higher rates of violent crime are experiencing the pandemic in a disproportionate way to, people who are maybe in a higher socioeconomic status than some of the lower socioeconomic status communities in the Pittsburgh area. So I think it creates this more of a hotbed for violent crime. And I think as time goes on, we're going to be able to look back and find out a lot about the nature of violent crime and how we can prevent it moving forward. So that's sort of my initial thought.
So this last chance for questions for Brittany or for any of our other speakers before we wrap up. Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, oh, I'm sorry, Kathy, Dr. Pelt, I didn't see your hand up.
I think she
Just virtual applause.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so on behalf of Duquesne University, I would like to thank our four speakers for outstanding and interesting presentations today. I would also like to thank Sydney Yates and Dee Hubei with Dr. Kathy Pelt for putting together this outstanding week of events. It's been really an outstanding job, ladies. So I'd like to thank you all for coming today. If you have any questions, anything else you'd like to add from the audience before we sign out?
Thank you so much. It was great.
No, thank you, Dee. Thank you, Sydney. All right, so we're going to call it an end. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully we'll see you on the afternoon session.
just make sure to stop the recording.
Stop.
and send it to